Hello, everyone. Welcome to my show, Curryup Startup Podcast, a podcast to spotlight world class Asian entrepreneurs, C suite executives, and leaders who provide insights from their personal journey to inspire you. And this is your host, Priyanka Komala. For our listeners, we're super excited on our 58th episode of Curryup Startup Podcast, which is triple streaming live on LinkedIn, YouTube, and Twitter. Thanks so much for your loyal support, and we really appreciate all the encouragement that we get from each one of you. And do remember to continue to subscribe to us by following me, Priyanka Komala, on LinkedIn for your LinkedIn live notifications, as well as our Curryup Startup podcast page on LinkedIn. We're also on YouTube, Twitter at Pod Startup, and your favorite podcast streaming platforms. On today's episode, I'm so happy and honored to bring in somebody who comes from a different walk of life. Well, there are three main reasons why you should listen to this podcast, because I have an amazing guest who is a reporter with TechCrunch, one of the largest tech news channels here in the US. And I'm going to unveil who my special guest is.
Hello.
Hey, Natasha.
Hi. I don't know if I'm C-suite or a leader, but hopefully I don't disappoint and can be useful to your guests. Thanks for having me.
Thank you, Natasha. You're a rising star in the field of tech, and you do amazing work to help amplify the stories of C-suite leaders, venture capitalists, and startups. So what better way than bringing you onto the show to provide a platform to hear perspectives behind the scenes as a reporter?
Yes, exactly. No, it definitely is one of the best parts of my job is that I get to talk to smart people, report on it, and then, pretend that I'm the smartest one of them all.
That's amazing. And you're definitely a rising star in the field of
Thank you.
reporting. So to our listeners, three reasons why you should be listening to this podcast. Well, you want to know the secret sauce behind writing newsworthy articles or building your personal brand? Well, you're here in the right place. Have you wondered what does it take to be a reporter in the field of startups or venture capitalists, especially working at TechCrunch? The most fascinating aspect for me is, as an Asian, as a women of color writer, what kind of lens can we bring to the table when we author articles? And I could look no further than Natasha Mascarenhas to be part of the show.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I am an open book, so bring on the questions. Open to answer anything.
Thank you, Natasha. So here we are tuning live. She's from New Jersey and I'm here in Washington, D.C. It's been so stormy and windy, so we're super excited to see how Mother Nature is going to play into our live broadcast today.
It's funny, as for anyone just tuning in, before when we were backstage, we were both comparing notes on how it's so stormy. But the moment the podcast started, the sun has broken out in gray New Jersey. And so maybe I'll be lucky, but there's been tornado warnings and hurricane warnings, so who knows?
But it's always nice to give it a try, right? That's the best part about reporting. We do whatever best we can.
Yes, exactly. We try to do the best.
Thank you. So to our listeners, if you're tuning in live, please let us know where you're tuning in from and your name. We would love to say a hello to you. And we actually have a live listener who just dropped in a quick comment. Hey, Ritu. Ritu Sahib is from New York as well. And she's an architect and was my previous guest on this show. So it's always nice to hear from Ritu.
Awesome. Hi, Ritu.
Thanks, Ritu, for joining us. And we have an amazing free mentoring session that Natasha is going to provide to one of our lucky listeners. So keep those questions and comments coming, and let's see who that lucky winner would be. Now, Natasha, I want to start with your interesting background. So you majored you majored in journalism, and here you are having worked with Crunchbase and now with TechCrunch. How do you see life as a journalist?
It's crazy. It is a way to process what has been probably the wildest year of most of our lives and will be the wildest year of our lives going forward, looking back. So it's been a really great way to just process and understand as everything kind of gets thrown at us. And I think as a journalist specifically, I started journalism. I tell two different stories when people ask why journalism and how did you get here? And I say one side was when I was younger, I would always write poetry and creative stories. And my parents, who are both Indian, would say, you need to do something a little bit more professional. And so I just thought like the first thing that came to mind was, okay, journalism seems like a more professional way to creatively write. And so I joined newspaper club in 6th grade and kind of have stuck with it then. But as time has gone on, I've kind of realized that, the true and not joking reason that being a journalist is kind of what gets me up every morning is that there's this really unique kind of responsibility you get as a journalist for people to listen to you and actually take you seriously that so few people get. And it's an equalizer. I get to talk to, CEOs with, trillions more than me, but I get to, share their stories and amplify voices of people who have far less than me. And I think it's a really interesting place to play, especially, now as everyone's at home.
That's very true. Well, you were the editor-in-chief of Bridgewater Raritan newspaper, The Prowler, back in high school.
Oh my gosh, yes.
So you kind of knew that you wanted to be a journalist from a very young age.
Yeah. So, 6th grade, joined newspaper club. I remember when I went to high school, there was only one journalism class you took. I took it my first quarter of freshman year and then, was so sad I had nothing left to do and kind of helped bring the newspaper along. And then kind of from there, I went to Boston University and studied journalism as well.
That's pretty cool. So at TechCrunch, you cover Edtech startups, the next generation of founders and investors, early stage startups and venture capital trends. Tell us a little bit more about what does a day look like in the life of Natasha?
Yeah, I mean, this is a weird week, right? I think that everyone and their mother is trying to get their news out between the election and Thanksgiving and the holidays. And so this is a weird time to be a journalist only just because you're being inundated with a ton of news. I'm going to be working through the holidays. So to anyone listening, please feel free to pitch me during the slow in between weeks. But no, I usually cover, a mix of breaking news, feature stories, and, startup financings as they raise money through venture capitalists. And I think, more specifically with TechCrunch, since I joined back in March, kind of 2 days into the pandemic, I think I had one day in the office before it closed down. I've been reporting a lot on education, and I started writing about education the day that Stanford closed its classes. And so I've kind of traveled alongside the entire boom of EdTech, and I'm hoping to kind of cover it through what can either be a bust or a any sort of iteration as education kind of evolves past pandemic, remote learning, Zoom school.
And I'm so glad you've picked on this topic of education because that's like a must-have part of our life. And you brought in the question about the pandemic, how people are juggling with, homeschooling their kids, trying to take care of them to make sure the education doesn't get in the way of the pandemic.
Yeah, I think that it is a really, emotional field to cover, unlike tech that maybe is only built for 1% of people or, the San Francisco worker. Education is just a global emotional conversation. And to cover it is, it's a huge responsibility, but it's also, wow, I'm realizing what a disconnect there is between, sometimes Silicon Valley and a public school teacher in New York. It sounds obvious in retrospect, but it wasn't until I reported it that I really understood how much more needs to be said. And just because the coronavirus has kind of put a spotlight on education, I'm hoping to kind of cover it long after this pandemic hopefully ends.
That's pretty amazing. And I'm so glad we have writers like you who are passionate about bridging the gap between education and the society.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, it's like I said, I think it's a cool responsibility to get people to listen to me. So I'll always try and do my best with elevating, the right voices.
That's amazing. Now tell us about TechCrunch. To a layperson, how would you explain TechCrunch?
TechCrunch is a really special place. So I think, the newest addition to the team. So I'm about 8 or 9 months into my job there. But I would say that it's unlike every newsroom I've ever worked in before. Before TechCrunch, I was at Crunchbase News, the Boston Globe, the San Francisco Chronicle, and also my hometown newspaper here in Jersey. And I think those were all really special places. But TechCrunch, I think, is so diverse because of the innate hustle and nerdiness. There at any given moment, you can find someone talking about space, about the future of automotives, about the latest VC drama. There's such a wide span of interests, and the trust that our editors have for us. And I swear I'm not being paid to say this, but I really do think the trust our editors have. And we're not going to tell you have to write X, Y, and Z. We're just going to trust that you will, I think makes such a big difference, because it just shows that we're all kind of like entrepreneurial in what we like to write about, and all really, hungry and curious and crazy to a healthy degree.
That's very true. Now, tell me this. You meet a lot of C-suite executives and venture capitalists as part of your job. What is one thing you've learned from them, just observing them as part of writing about them?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I'm trying to think of one big lesson. Maybe I'll give two as a small cop out. I think one is that, and I wish I knew this when I entered college, it's just people are really smart, but they don't know everything that their title kind of has the connotation of. And so I think that I consistently meet amazing executives and VCs who are really smart, but they're not as scary or untouchable as their title might make them seem. And so I think there is like this really big human side of tech that I think is growing. And I'm always really happy to understand and be a part of kind of bringing these people you see on Twitter or on CNBC down to the real world and trying to like humanize them a little bit. And so I kind of say I wish I knew this in college, because you get nervous when you have a really big CEO on your calendar when you're starting out as a journalist. And I think it's your job to disarm them and to make them feel like they can trust you, because they should be able to trust you, not as a friend, but as someone who will listen to their story and doesn't need to use talking points. And so I think that's kind of maybe been the biggest takeaway. The second is I think that I think empathy goes a long way when talking to people in startups and tech, because so much of networking in any career really is transactional. And I think, I've had to be paused by an interviewee a couple times, but being like, whoa, before we get into questions, like, let's just catch up as humans. And I think it makes a huge difference to enter those conversations, no matter what stage you are in your profession, with a little bit of empathy. And I think it changes the entire conversation.
You bring up a very human point about connecting with people, right? And that's something that I can totally relate with. I've interviewed C-suite leaders, people from different aspects of life. And even you, when I reached out, right, you always have this persona that, somebody going to, take time to help you in your endeavor to spotlight their stories and see how approachable you were. It's just like making that first connection.
Yeah, no, and I think like Twitter, I think we connected through Twitter. I think Twitter has probably been like the biggest career changer for me. It's how I got my job at TechCrunch. I remember I DM'd the editor-in-chief off the whim, just asking if he wanted to grab coffee. And he kind of responded a few months later. And then a few months after that, I was hired. And obviously it wasn't as simple as a DM. Like I had to prove myself, but I think Twitter has been such an interesting spot to live in. Sometimes too much, but it is, it's a place where people are willing to give free advice, and you can learn so much. I think I've learned more on Twitter than I have from undergrad, and I loved my school.
That's pretty fascinating observation, right? I mean, the world of social media is definitely a powerful tool if we are able to leverage it in the right way.
Totally.
Now, to our live listeners who have tuned in, a handful of them have tuned in, please drop a quick note through the comment box on who you are and where you're tuning from. So it gives a chance to Natasha to know who her listeners are. And also drop in a question or a comment to win a free mentoring session, which is exclusive to our Curryup Startup Podcast listeners with Natasha, where you can learn more about how do you break into the field of journalism, or maybe if you're a startup or a venture capitalist, how do you talk to the press to leverage your stories in the right way? Or as someone who's planning to build your personal brand, get some tips and exclusive advice from Natasha. So put your thinking hats on for those exclusive mentoring session with Natasha. Natasha, something I wanted to ask deeper into this, get more deeper into the story is, as an Asian, as a woman of color, how do you see working as a journalist? Is it a level playing field for somebody like you?
There's definitely the horror stories, not at my current job, or honestly, even in the past few years, of being kind of looked at as other. But I definitely do think in the beginning there was a weird tokenization when I was first breaking into journalism years ago. I remember at one point I I have this unique tendency. My current editor will tell you now and laugh at it, to like use weird words and phrasings. And, it's an inside joke with my friends too. But I think that's honestly just a quirk of who I am. It's not, I was born in New Jersey, and I think that obviously English is my first language. Anyways, in my first internship as a journalist, I remember the editor kind of bringing me into his office at the end of the day, being like, giving me kind of my review about my internship. And he was like, listen, I get that English isn't, your first language, but so I hope going forward, you can start refining your language a little bit more. And I just had to I remember not really saying anything and kind of leaving, and only getting it a few years later that was kind of just inherently racist, and believing that I wasn't, and it's fine if I wasn't born in the United States, but to assume I wasn't because I had a different word choice, I think was weird. And that same editor also made me kind of listen to an Indian person with an Indian accent, trying to decipher it. And I think that also kind of ended up being a little bit off base. And so there are these weird moments where, as a female, you're told, did you get that story because you batted your pretty little eyelashes? That you are reminded that you're not the majority in the field. But I think it's changing. And I think so many of the journalists I looked up to and continue to look up to, making room for people like me, and elevating my voice and giving me opportunity, like the kind of opportunity I have at TechCrunch is really key to changing that.
It's interesting to see how the field is changing. And I'm so glad with you breaking the barriers, you can lead to better opportunities with the next generation of folks who want to be journalists.
I hope so. I think the best feeling in the world is getting a DM from an Indian female journalist who wants advice, because it just means that in some way they found me, they see some sort of entrance for them to break into the field. And I think that I will always pick up those calls because people picked up those calls for me. The reason I got my job at the San Francisco Chronicle was because a woman named Trisha Thadani, who's still there and does amazing work, responded to my cold DM on Twitter. And I think that that it just goes such a far way. And it's not novel advice, but it does it's where I get joy.
That's amazing. And to all our listeners, Natasha is very approachable. So follow her on Twitter and DM her to get to know more about her and share some interesting tidbits as fellow Asians who are trying to break barriers in our own different fields.
Yeah, I think one of my favorite activities to do is tweet about how my parents understand my job and understand journalism. They are huge supporters. After I kind of made the move from creative writing to journalism, and the way they kind of understand my job now, and any brown people who are listening will get it too, is they say that I cover companies like Uber before they become Uber, and to them that's the best way to phrase it. And I think that it's really fun to convince my parents to read my work, and I take it as a challenge, which is, part of the reason I have a newsletter that I write hopefully once a week, not so much recently, on Substack, where I write kind of more general non-tech musings, but embed my pieces there. So people who, maybe aren't in love with tech or startups yet start to care about it a little bit more.
That's pretty cool. And we'll post a link to her Substack blog post as well, so you can get a chance to understand the different flavors of writing that Natasha brings to us. Now, tell us about mentorship. I know one of your key inspirations is Marianne Azevedo. Can you talk a little bit about her?
Yeah, I mean, Marianne is such a special person. I worked with her at Crunchbase News, and she's now starting her own kind of publication with FinLedger. And so I recommend anyone interested in kind of fintech news from a diverse set of journalists to follow that out. And look at the amazing work she's doing. But Marianne is really special because she brings a sort of hustle and humility that you just don't find super often. She consistently is, very open and vulnerable. And I think she is one of the people that has helped me really embrace the fact that I am a journalist that kind of brings empathy to my reporting instead of kind of aggressive scoops. There's room for both. And I want to get to a place where I'm doing the big investigative pieces. But I think journalists like her make a big difference in telling you, listen, empathy is your competitive advantage. that can be your competitive advantage. You don't need to fit this mold of being a journalist that, people are scared to pick up the phone from. And I think that has gone a really long way when as I'm early in my career still trying to figure out my voice. And I mean, I think the list of mentors continues. One of the best mentors I have is Mitchell Zuckoff, who was my professor at Boston University. And, he did a really good job of teaching you to like interview the person you think makes no sense for the story, but is tangentially related. If you're writing about the CEO of a company, interview the barista that he gets his order or she gets his order from each week. And I think that kind of perspective, it's just like you need people in your life who are going to nerd out about the same thing you do. And I think those are like what you need to find in a mentor, is someone who like lights up the same way you do when talking about your field.
That's very true. And people around the actual person who needs to be interviewed have different perspectives, which give you interesting tidbits on the personality, that is being projected.
Totally. I remember when I was covering the Massachusetts legalization of marijuana in 2016, it was for Mitchell Zuckoff's class, and he basically was like, yeah, interview anyone you think could talk. And I interviewed, a woman at a duck tour booth. And duck tours, for anyone who doesn't know, are kind of like the big ducks that are in Boston that you kind of go in the water and also go on the streets. But she had this amazing perception of it. And I thought maybe only I'll interview students or I'll interview people as they leave the voting booths. But I think I think the role of a journalist is to elevate voices that wouldn't otherwise be heard, or could share a perspective that wouldn't otherwise be understood. And so I think that was one of the highlight stories that I ever wrote, even though it was never published.
That's the part of the field, right? Not all stories get to see the limelight, but that's just a way of life.
Totally. I think as I kind of grow my audience, it's giving a good, healthy amount of pressure to keep putting out really good work and making sure I keep rethinking who I interview and why I'm interviewing them. Is it because they're easy? Is it because they're loud on Twitter? Hopefully neither of those things. Hopefully they're just people that are smart and are providing are saying something that other people are either unable to say or too scared to.
That's very true. And storytelling plays a very key part, right? In terms of highlighting those hidden stories.
Totally.
Let's take a quick moment to acknowledge some of our guests and their comments as well. We have Neeta Jain from New Jersey. It's an interesting chat, Priyanka and Natasha. Hi, Neeta. Welcome to the show. Satya says, hi, Priyanka. Very interesting interview. Keep it up. Thank you. We have Shravanti Anumakonda from New Jersey. Hi, Shravanti.
I love all the New Jersey.
I know. There's a strong suite of supporters for you from New Jersey here. Amit Purswani from Mumbai. Hey, Amit. Anita says she would love the opportunity to get that mentorship. So we already have people queuing up. So to our listeners, again, wonderful chance to get a free mentoring session with Natasha. So please drop in a quick comment or a question for Natasha as well. So Natasha, let me ask you this. Because of the pandemic, a lot of people are more focused on building their brand in technology, be it like a startup CEO like who Neeta Jain is, or some of our listeners who are trying to build their own personal brand. You write great articles. What is one advice you would give to them to put themselves out in the best possible way?
Yeah, I think there's so many ways I could approach this question. Maybe the first would be to have an online presence in some way. While I just said I don't like only interviewing the loudest voices on Twitter, I also meet a lot of people who maybe don't have a bunch of followers, but are able to articulate their thoughts clearly on Twitter. And that ends up feeding a lot of my coverage and who I decide to interview. And so I think if you have something to say, you should say it. You should not wait for a journalist to come knocking on your door or for you to get a fundraising round or for you to get this, this very elusive metric of success before you start sharing. I'm a huge supporter in everyone being their own writer. And I think that I have to empathize with my friends who are all great writers, by the way, but they don't publish because they're scared. And I totally empathize with that. But I do think they're, a part of everyone's trajectory as they're trying to build a personal brand is being a little bit more external and learning to show off about themselves. And I think that that's something that I think is so key when you're building your brand, is like just speaking up, publishing, even if it's 200 words and you want to slowly get to 400 words and then maybe 1,000 words on a topic, because you are the only person who can kind of perfectly sum up your mindset. And so my big advice there would be just don't wait to talk, just start talking.
That's great advice. And the first step is kind of hard and difficult because you're venturing into the unknown.
Yeah.
And one of the challenges you have is, how would people perceive me? And sometimes it might not be the way you want it to be, but
Totally.
you just have to tell your story.
Totally. I think, and that's so true. I think that I really do feel for people who are nervous about publishing. And I think that's why I try and be as open as possible to reading friends' work or lifting them up. I just think that, it doesn't have to be, that same professor in college, he told me that my first 500 stories essentially don't count. They're not the cream of the crop of my work. And I will consistently be beating myself with each story I write. It just matters how many words I get through my fingers. And one day that story will be something I'm super proud of. Now, I think I've written stories I'm really proud of so far, but I think that advice is so key to anyone looking to start vocalizing more, is like your first 500 musings, first 500 tweets, stories, whatevers, are not going to be life-changing. They could be, but don't try and go in trying to change the world with your first post, because I think it takes a lot of effort. It takes building up a following over time, and it takes like getting people to trust you. You have to keep doing good work for people to trust you. And I think that's what I'm trying to do at TechCrunch, while covering early stage in education. And it's what I'm trying to do on my blog as a person in my meetings right now, is just like getting people to believe that I have something to say. And then one day, they'll start listening.
We all are already listening. So tell us about Equity Pod, a podcast that you're leading to help amplify the stories of startups. What's the best part about Equity Pod?
The best part of the Equity Pod is the co-host and our producer, which is not even a cop-out. I love that part of my week. I think we lost Priyanka, but I'm going to keep talking. So Equity Pod...
I'm still here.
Okay, great. Equity Pod is TechCrunch's weekly podcast about venture capital and startups. And I do it with my colleagues, Alex Wilhelm, Danny Creighton, and Chris Gates. And so we all riff on kind of the biggest startup stories of the week, as I mentioned, and add in our own flavor. And I think it's really fun, obviously, to be a diverse part of the show and like just trade notes with like the smartest people I know. Like they're Danny and Alex and Chris are all really great people. Alex was my former boss at Crunchbase. And so it's definitely a full circle moment. But I think with Equity Pod, for example, I was thrown into that gig, I think 2 weeks into joining TechCrunch, and it's been really fun to get more confident as time goes on in my voice. I love speaking, but I write so often that I usually am not just as comfortable with speaking. And so it's been a really great way to like figure out how to distill my my 100 million thoughts into a podcast once a week. It just lets me get any extra tidbits I found during the week into a format for more people, because not everyone loves to read, and that's okay. And I will happily talk to anyone through that podcast once a week. And I feel really lucky that I get to.
That's pretty impressive. What's a startup story that you're covering that's very fascinating?
Ooh, in terms of like a topic or a startup itself?
Both of it, we'd be curious to know.
Yeah, I mean, I think that with education, again, I think the biggest story that I'm interested in pursuing is like this disconnect between parents and founders. Is like founders are claiming that they are having these insane surges. Parents are claiming that there's no solutions. And so like my big challenge as I put together my end of the year coverage is figuring out where the disconnect is, why it's happening. A lot of it's inequities, but I want to, peel back and see like what parents are really wanting right now. I'm not a parent, but I have parents. And I think there are so many questions that I have for people who have kids, because they are doing God's work. And I think that even on the outside, it may not seem like a startup story, but I mean, innately, they're selling to families. And if EdTech ever wants to be successful, it needs to do that correctly. And so, it's kind of my loophole to get to talk to people outside of tech and startups to cover that.
That's pretty impressive. Now, tell me this. Have you ever had a low moment in your life, and how do you handle those low moments?
Oh my gosh, I don't know if anyone has ever not had a low moment. I think it's weird how to process and understand. I would love to tell you that the way I deal with my low moments is by journaling and being super in charge of my mental health, but that is not the case. Moving home has brought its own sets of challenges. Just as an extrovert, I am very lucky with my pandemic experience so far, touch wood. But as an extrovert, I'm just missing that human contact sometimes. And so I think the best way that I do self care and try to lift out of it is just by like asking for help. And I get in my head a lot, but I just try and consistently bear my emotions on my sleeves and trust too hard. And even when I think I will always be someone who will trust too hard and put friends and family on a pedestal instead of being cold and not believing in, the power of humanity. So I think that like my way of getting through it is just putting more belief in people. It's definitely not always worked out. Like I've definitely been burned by putting people on pedestals, but I think that it has been so worth it to make mistakes and have low moments because I get to, have all these warm moments now.
That's pretty impressive. And thanks for being vulnerable and sharing, all these highs and lows and how you handle it, as a
Totally.
reporter.
Yeah, I think like I say this advice all the time. So anyone who is listening that either reads my blog or follows me on Twitter will tell me to shut up. But I think like the biggest like takeaway of 2020 and just like early 20s in general for me being in my early 20s is that like I am the reason I have, a great community around me, a great job, and am healthy. It's not because of anything else. Of course, my parents and my community have like given me the privilege to do so. But in terms of attracting warm people and a good life, I think like it's what I bring to the table. And I think like the moment you start believing that you're your superpower is the moment that you start being, I think, a happier person that depends less on the people around you to lift them up.
That's pretty cool. We have a question from one of our listeners, Neil Thompson, and he wants to know, what are you going to do after the pandemic? Are you looking forward to a move from New Jersey back to the West Coast?
Yeah. Thanks, Neil. I think I am definitely planning to move back. I don't know when, but my boyfriend and best friends all are home right now and are hoping to move back to San Francisco for at least a while. TechCrunch has been really cool with letting me live anywhere, but I think like San Francisco, I'm just not done with it yet. It has been really a great place for me. And so I definitely want to come back, and I will maybe do like a hybrid living style of like 6 months in SF, 6 months in New Jersey with my family. But to be determined, because making plans does not work in 2020.
We all have learned a lesson, right?
Yeah, exactly. I was joking. I mean, thank God, and I feel for any college student right now, but like I feel like a lot of my life events have kind of ended for at least a few years. Is like I graduated, I got my first job, I moved, I did all these things that required community and required literally moving. And now I can kind of, as much as it can seem like you're wasting your 20s in quarantine, I think it's like I'd rather waste my 20s in quarantine than waste any other decade, I think.
It's interesting to see how the younger generation of millennials look at life. As a millennial myself, I'm more on the other side of the curve, thinking of much more like a stable way of living. I love your go-getter attitude.
Oh, thank you. No, I mean, I'll be real. Like, I do love the idea of like having my own spot and being a stable human, but I do think that like it's just, I don't know. I love too many people who don't live in the same damn zip code. And because of that, I have to, my best friend in the whole world lives on the East Coast. She's a med student at Drexel. And my parents and my brother is a teacher here. They're all on the East Coast, but then the other half of my hair is on the West Coast. So I don't think I'm allowed to be stable. I think I'm going to do both for a while.
Hey, find what makes you happy. That's what you need at the end of the day.
Totally.
All right. So we have a fun rapid fire round for you. Are you ready for it?
I am ready. Let's do it.
That's amazing. So you tell me the first thing that comes to your mind when I say the following, and in one word, okay? Role model.
Mom.
What does happiness mean to you?
Community.
What does success mean to you?
Stories.
How do your parents look at your success, if I may ask?
Proudly.
What is one fun thing about Natasha that you haven't shared with anyone and it's exclusive to our listeners?
Let me think. Can I use more than one word?
Oh, sure, go for it.
Okay, I think I'm like amazing at making tofu. Like, I know that's not the most creative fact, but I am so good at making tofu, and I'm really proud of it. I think that has been my biggest quarantine glow up, is that I can cook tofu and make it taste good, that even my carnivore friends will love it.
That's amazing. It's nice to see what are the skill sets we can actually unveil within ourselves during this pandemic.
I know, it's so weird. I don't know. I feel like tofu is such an inconsequential type of activity to cook, but it means the world to me now, because everything has to mean the world to you when you have such a smaller world.
I know, very true. What is your native language and one word to describe yourself in it?
My native language is English, and I think I am very verbose. I talk a lot, as I'm sure everyone has learned today. And I can keep talking about something if you make me.
That's pretty amazing. That brings us to the end of the show. So I'm going to quickly ask you, tell us your experience being on Curryup Startup Podcast. What do you like about the podcast and why should people listen to it?
Yeah, no, Priyanka, thank you for such thoughtful questions. I think you brought some awesome perspective, and I think kind of the reason people should listen to Curryup Startup Podcast is it's at least a chance to get to know about someone who's outside of your current network. It doesn't mean you have to like me or even be best friends with me, even though I welcome more friends, but I think it's always cool to again, humanize people for no reason other than why not, and to learn about a profession other than your own. So thank you for letting me kind of share my tips and tricks and thoughts, especially being so young in my career. I'm appreciating that you think I have something worth listening to.
Absolutely. You're a rising star at TechCrunch, and it was such an honor for me to reach out to you. And it was so interesting to our listeners just behind the scenes. Natasha reached out to me almost a year ago and she said, I was very new to the podcasting space back then. I had done almost 10 episodes or so. And she was like, I love the fabulous content you put together to amplify Asian voices. So since then, we've been in touch. And now we are at 58 episodes live streaming. And here you go. Natasha has always been a great cheerleader for us.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, it is so great to see a focus on South Asians, especially in the world of startups and tech. You see the really high up C-suite executives, but it really does warm my heart whenever I get to meet a fellow brown person in tech and just learn what brought them here, because this is not an easy world to navigate, and it's not picture perfect or even super, fitting into what our culture defines as success. And so, I very much am here to keep listening to the stories of other Asians who have defied odds and joined the crazy world and unstable world of startups.
And thank you. And we welcome you to the Curryup Startup Podcast family, where we have such amazing guests who continue to break barriers and empowering the Asian community.
Thanks so much, Priyanka. This was great.
Awesome. So before I let you go, we have to announce the winner of our free mentoring session. Are you ready for it, Natasha?
Yes, I am here too, and as a 24-year-old.
Mentoring breaks barriers in terms of age, ethnicity, culture, and there's reverse mentoring, right? You always learn from each other. So
Totally.
What a wonderful way to do this. All right. So let's see who that lucky winner is. I'm going to give it to Neeta Jain, who's also a startup founder, and she would love your mentorship and can benefit from it. So how about Neeta Jain?
Awesome. Yeah, Neeta, feel free to DM me on LinkedIn. I hate DMs on LinkedIn, but I'll make an exception for you. And we can set up a time to chat maybe next week or something.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Natasha. Really appreciate that. And Neeta, I'm going to connect you offline with Natasha as well, so you get
Perfect.
a chance to get that mentoring session, and do let us know your feedback on your key takeaways from the mentoring sessions as well. Natasha, any parting thoughts to listeners? One advice when you look at your 25-year-old self, you want to change something when you look back at your life so far, which could be a parting thought for us?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's just to believe that you have something to say that no one else can say, because no one else is you. And even if you don't have the perfect words right now in this exact moment, if you start speaking out loud, you'll get there eventually. And so I very much urge you to start speaking up.
Thank you, Natasha, for those kind words. And congratulations again, Neeta Jain, for winning that free mentorship. To all our other listeners, do continue to stay connected to Curryup Startup Podcast by following me, Priyanka Komala, if you're on LinkedIn, just go ahead, follow, or our Curryup Startup Podcast page. So you get to know our LinkedIn live shows and also get a chance to meet with this wonderful community of guests and also receive specials as we go forward. If you're tuning on YouTube, don't forget to hit that subscribe icon so you can stay tuned on our upcoming episodes as well. And hit that like or share or your comments for your comments on Twitter and other social media platforms as well. Until another episode, which is going to happen next week, this is your host, Priyanka Komala, signing off from Curryup Startup Podcast, a podcast to spotlight world-class Asian leaders, C-suite executives, entrepreneurs, and rising stars like Natasha to get inspired from their personal journey. And this is your host again, signing off. Have a wonderful rest of the day.